splashed, and I carried my seed, planted it again on some higher ground. Tookie, 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 tidal. Tookie, 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 tidal. Let's all dance around, see my little seed grow. The sun got hot and my ground got dry. I thought my little seed would burn and die. I carried some water from a watering mill. I said, little seed, you can drink your fill. Tookie, 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 tidal. Tookie, 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 tidal. Let's all dance around, see my little seed grow. The snow it blowed and the wind it blew. My little seed, it grew and it grew. It grew up a cradle, all soft inside, and a baby was sleeping, covered over with vines. Tookie, 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 tidal. Tookie, 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 tidal. Let's all dance around, see my little seed grow.
Mama told me and my teacher told me too, there's all kinds of work that I can do. Dry my dishes, sweep my floor, but if we all work together, it won't take very long. We all work together with a wiggle and a giggle. We all work together with a giggle and a grin. We all work together with a wiggle and a giggle. We all work together with a giggle and a grin. My sister told me, brother told me too, there's lots of work that I can do. I bring her candy, bring her gum, but if we all work together, hadn't ought to take long. We all work together with a wiggle and a giggle. We all work together with a giggle and a grin. We all work together with a wiggle and a giggle. We all work together with a giggle and a grin. My daddy said, and my grandpa too, there's work for me to do. I can paint my fence, mow my lawn, but if we all work together, it won't take very long. We all work together with a wiggle and a giggle. We all work together with a giggle and a grin. We all work together with a wiggle and a giggle. We all work together with a giggle and a grin. I tell my mom and daddy and my grandma too, my sister and my brother, lots of work for me to do. You can bring me pennies and candy and gum, but if we all work together, it won't take very long. We all work together with a wiggle and a giggle. We all work together with a giggle and a grin. We all work together with a wiggle and a giggle. We all work together with a giggle and a grin. With a wiggle and a giggle and a google and a woogie and a jigger and a jigger and a giggle and a grin. A wiggle and a giggle and a google and a woogie and a jigger and a jigger and a giggle and a grin. Well, I went to the dance and the animals come. Jaybird danced with horseshoes on. Grasshopper danced till they fell on the floor. Jig along, jig along, jig along home. Jig, 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 jig along home. Jig, 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 jig along home. Jig along, jig along, jig along home. Jig, 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 jig along home. The fishing worm done the fishing reel. Lobster danced on peacock's tail. Baboon danced with the rising moon. Jig along, jig along, jig along home. Jig, 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 jig along home. Jig, 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 jig along home. Jig along, jig along, jig along home. Jig, 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 jig along home. The rooster cut his weevil of wheat. The catfish tromped the cuckoo's feet. The ostrich stomped with the kangaroo. Jig along, jig along, jig along home. Jig, 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 jig along home. Jig, 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 jig along home. Jig along, jig along, jig along home. Jig, 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 jig along home. And the mama rat took off her hat, shook the house with the old tomcat. Alligator beat his tail on the drum. Jig along, jig along, jig along home. Jig, 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 jig along home. Jig, 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 The clouds they laughed and the world did quake. New moon rattled some silver spoon. Jig along, jig along, jig along home. Jig, 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 jig along home. Jig, 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 jig along home. Jig along, jig along, jig along home. Jig, 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 jig along home. The nails flew loose and the boards broke down. Everybody danced around and around. The house come down and the crowd went home. Jig along, jig along, jig along home. Jig, 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 jig along home. Jig, 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 jig along home. Jig along, jig along, jig along home. Jig, 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 jig along home. Jig, 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 jig along home. Jig, 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 jig along home. Jig along, jig along, jig along home. Jig, 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 jig along home.
Come, let's see the merry-go-round, the merry-go-round, the merry-go-round. Come, let's see the merry-go-round, go round and around and around. Come, let's rub the pony's hair, the pony's hair, the pony's hair. Lots of ponies that we can ride around and around and around. Oh, now let's climb on the pony's back, the pony's back, the pony's back. Pick up the reins and buckle our straps around and around and around. It's off we go so nice and slow. It's up to the clouds and down we go. Up and down and around and around and around and around. It's faster now, the pony runs up to the moon and down to the sun. Pony runs to the music and drums around and around and around. Well, now he runs as fast as the wind, and he gallops and trots and dances a jig. Pony is tired and he wants to slow down around